Great to be here today. My name is Elizabeth Adamson. I am one of the seminar coordinators for the SPRC seminar series, along with Kira, who's also joining us today. I'm just going to do very quick housekeeping introductions and then pass it over because we have a full program today and we want to make sure they have lots of time to speak. So today's seminar is called Reinterpreting Urban Life, Living Through COVID in Cities. And we have Professor Bill Randolph, who is going to be facilitating the session. Just before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Bingqin people who are the traditional custodians on the lands where UNSW Sydney is. And also I'd like to pay my respects to the Larrakia people who are the traditional owners on the land where I live and work. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. And feel free to add in the chat or in your names where you're from. That's always a nice kind of way to bring everyone together. So I will now hand over to Susan Thompson, who is the first presenter. Just to also say that it is being recorded and to keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. Thanks very much. You can
Thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, great. Sorry. Well, thank you, everyone, and hello. And this evening, I'm talking to you from the border of Wongal and Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. For over 2 decades, my academic research and education has been at the interface of urban planning and public health. I've focused on this key question: how do we plan, design, build and maintain cities and towns that make it easy and enjoyable for people to be physically active, to be socially connected, and to be able to access nutritious and fresh foods, all as part of their everyday living? These are the 3 most important behaviours that we can adopt to support health and well-being for a long, happy and independent life. And I think this has a lot to do with cities and COVID. So here are my 3 points on what's important about the impact of COVID on cities from a healthy planning perspective. Living through COVID has reinforced the importance of the local. The actual place, its sociability, the ease of being able to connect with friends and to look out for neighbours, the availability of services close by, and with that, the valuing of proximity and the enjoyment of what's around the corner. Indeed, for many, discovering that notion of what's around the corner for the very first time. But perhaps this joy of the local is not the reality for all, and possibly only for those in well-serviced and aesthetically pleasing inner suburban areas. And I offer that as a question. My second point is that living through COVID has reinforced the importance of our health and well-being, showing us that looking after ourselves is part of everyday ordinary living. It's not an add-on. It's not an extra. It's a human right to be able to achieve this. And thirdly, COVID has reinforced for many and for others provided a new awakening of the health-place link. In other words, the supportive nature of place for health. This is very much associated with the plentiful availability of close-by green space. And this is all sorts of green space. And being able to get out and about in green space, which is what I've been showing to you in my slides. Green space provides a multitude of physical and mental health benefits from early childhood to later life. And it's well documented in the research. These benefits range from reducing risks for chronic long-term diseases to enhancing children's social development and older people's social connections. Green space connects us with each other and with the environment and the urgent imperative to protect our planet. At the very least, we experience the seasons and sounds of nature as we move through parks, along walkways and in bushland areas. And as city dwellers, this is incredibly calming. I could say a lot more, and I hope my images, which I've taken in different cities across the globe, have said many of those things for you. And I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Matt Costa for his thoughts and reflections. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Susan. That was not only informative, but quite poetic. And I don't think I can match that poetic tone, but I have some, I suppose, more utilitarian insights to offer. So thanks so much for having me. I don't know if my screen is sharing correctly, but hopefully you can see. I'm an economist with the New South Wales Productivity Commission, and my engagement with urban life during COVID comes from leading the Commission's research on the future of work and the remote working revolution that we saw during the pandemic. I also come to the topic as an economic historian and historian of economic thought, affiliated with the Department of Political Economy at Sydney University, focusing on issues of economic, social and technological forces that drive long-term historical change. I'll just give a very brief synopsis of the Productivity Commission's findings and regarding COVID-19 and the remote working revolution. I can talk more expansively in the panel discussion, but I thought I'd stress that my views are my own and don't represent the New South Wales Government or Productivity Commission. But just regarding our research specifically for the Commission, the Commission and the Productivity Council, two bodies in New South Wales Government, ran two surveys of 1,500 New South Wales remotable workers during the pandemic. And we also undertook economic modelling on the impacts of remote working and a literature review on the effects of remote working. And I just wanted to highlight some really broad brush findings that we found about this shift. So I suppose the first is that once employers and employees were forced to try remote working, they really liked it by and large. Remote workers reported saving time commuting. We estimate those time savings for a full-time worker to be equivalent to over 3 weeks of extra annual leave. So that's almost double the national employment standard for annual leave as a benefit. And both workers and managers agreed that remote working was more productive by 15 to 17% on average per hour, so major productivity benefits. And we also saw that remote working really added to our economic resilience during the pandemic. It enabled 832,000 non-essential New South Wales workers to keep working during the lockdown. And these are people who weren't essential workers and who would otherwise have been stood down from their jobs. So it was a tremendous force of economic resilience. Our survey captured a moment also in early 2021, a really unique moment when COVID was eliminated and restrictions were removed, and a never to be repeated moment that gave us a sort of glimpse of a possible post-pandemic future. And what we saw was that rather than reverting to pre-pandemic patterns, employers and employees embraced hybrid working. People wanted the benefits of both remote and office work. And remote working remained at 67% higher than pre-pandemic levels. So we concluded from that remote and hybrid are here to stay, and this will bring real opportunities and challenges for urban life. But with that, I'll hand over to Bingqin.
Matt. Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I do not have a PPT, so I just, sorry, you have to stuck with me. And I'm on Gambania people's land, and I pay respect to elders past, present, and future. And my own research for many years has been on the impact of urbanization on the urban society and the constant challenges and conflicts between different social groups, between the society and the state in China. And during the COVID-19, for various reasons, it is hard to do research on China, particularly in the social policy field. So we did a project on the last mile food security. What I mean by last mile is from the food stores to home, in which we look at the roles of different stakeholders. We teamed up with partners in 6 cities in Europe and Asia. And we thought there might be a division between East and West, between authoritarian and the liberal countries. And the not so surprising finding is in such emergency, the different responses of each country, of course, are a result of the decision makers' judgment of the risks, resources, and capacity. The somewhat surprising finding is that in all cities, they have experienced the turning point from the initial chaos to a more composed management. And the turning point actually comes from the fact that the government stopped trying to dominate and try to accommodate the innovative solutions coming up by the communities. So this is my first message. This is even the case in the so-called draconian lockdown in Wuhan. And the second message is, interestingly, people talk about the fear of this disruption. And in our research, of course, we have this kind of situation that people, particularly in a full lockdown, everybody become vulnerable. So, so the whole logistics system is disrupted. But in the last mile, when you see people only several meters away from food and couldn't get it, and that is the kind of make people have serious fear about disruption. And at the same time, we also see some good forces of disruption. For example, in London and Sydney, we see the community organizations are incredibly innovative, and also they try to, sometimes they have to break the rules. And one may consider that to be disruption of the established rules in ordinary times. But then in the post-pandemic period, we probably need to think more about, given the fact that there's so much disaster, natural disasters and emergency situation, in what ways can we actually streamline the innovative energy and in the community and the capacity and the role of the state as coordinator. So that is the key messages I got. Thank you. And next, move on to Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's me, is that right, Matthew? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I might share my screen if that's okay. Hopefully this works okay. Let me try this again. Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Kearnes. I'm based in the School of Humanities and Languages, and I'm a geographer and so someone that works in the field of science and technology studies, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But I'm not a COVID researcher. I'm not really even an urbanist either. But I did have a particular experience of COVID that I wanted to just sort of take us back to. And it's kind of, I think, illustrated by this report in The Guardian. Again, I have no idea of the veracity of the figures being reported here. But and I wanted to dwell with this slide for a few moments. The acknowledgement that outcomes around COVID are deeply sort of reflected by or reflected through forms of social, political, economic, and cultural difference, and that has had profound implications in the Sydney context. I also want to dwell with the space between the outcomes here in the headline and the caption, which you may be able to read for this picture. The caption reads, "A woman waits for her COVID jab in front of the Lakemba Mosque's pop-up vaccination clinic last year, organised by the Lebanese Muslim Association with health authorities in Sydney." And then vaccine hesitancy can be an issue amongst migrant populations is the caption here. And I wanted to dwell with the differential between these two forms of knowledge. So my area of research, as I said, I work in the field of science and technology studies, and I think particularly about the political mobilization of expertise for a whole range of different sort of public policy problems. And obviously COVID is one particularly significant example of where expertise is mobilized in really interesting sorts of ways and contested. The mosque in question here is also on the same street where I grew up. And during the second lockdown, in a COVID-safe manner, I was cycling over to my parents' house to help them mow the lawn and pick their fruit trees as elderly residents. And I was trying to make sense of the forms of expertise that were on display in Lakemba and Greenacre in a practical sense, but at the same time thinking about the mobilization of particular forms of expertise in something like the 11 o'clock press conference, as we probably all remember being glued to in different ways during that period. So I've got a couple more slides, which I'll just raise through quickly. What we did in Sydney in the second lockdown is we segregated the city through what was euphemistically called LGAs of concern. So the left here is a map of one version of that LGA of that differential response to COVID, articulated particularly in the western suburbs of Sydney. That arrives in a city that is already disaggregated and divided economically, culturally, linguistically. The right-hand map here is just a map of Sydney's intense linguistic diversity, just one measure of a series of distinctions within the city. This features in lots of different kind of memes that you may be aware of. This is just taken from On His Soir, the university magazine and University of Sydney, the El Jenna line, noting a particular chain of charcoal chicken in the western suburbs taking over from the Red Rooster line, or the Harris Farm line, as some people call it. So we are already a divided city, and the lockdown measures, I think, were experienced as an intensification of a form of economic and cultural distinction that has a long history in the city of Sydney. A particular moment which you may recall was Kerry Chance speaking into this felt sort of context, speaking about her upbringing in Punchbowl, her employment in the western suburbs. It seemed to me an acknowledgement of the need to connect with communities, with diverse communities, particularly in the western suburbs of Sydney. What was not captured in this headline is that Chance's acknowledgement of her upbringing in Punchbowl was followed by a question from journalists about the role of the military in going door to door in Bankstown in the western suburbs. So this political space of it seemed to me of mobilization of a form of expertise that was approachable and responsive to community being immediately shut down by another logic, a logic of militarization. Another moment in this particular experience was of course the role of the military, and of course the acknowledgement by the then Deputy Prime Minister that curfew measures, mask mandates were a response to media pressure and weren't necessarily a response to a form of scientific expertise. Whether that's in fact true, whether the Deputy Prime Minister was speaking accurately in that context is another question. But of course, this is received in these suburbs as another example of a form of expertise being mobilized in ways that intensified felt experiences of discrimination. What was happening in Canterbury Bankstown, where I live, was also this kind of logic. So a distinction between what was called the Paris end of Sydney's Canterbury Bankstown with, and I'm quoting here, the virus-riddled suburbs of Bankstown and Fairfield. Again, really profoundly troubling kind of commentary in Sydney's major paper that bears on a whole questions of social, economic, and cultural distinction that I think emerge in really ugly ways in the context of the pandemic and the context of the lockdown. Compare that with, for example, the thing that I started with, which was what was going on underneath the surface was pop-up clinics, locally approachable vaccine efforts, and a really profound effort at local levels to vaccinate communities. So what do I take from all this? what I take from this is three things. There was a persistent framing throughout 2021 of the individual COVID subject as a subject of deviance. There's language about large families, parties, people doing the wrong thing as being the root cause of the spread of the virus, as compared to a more structural analysis of the reasons why people needed to move around the city. There was seemingly an acknowledgement within the New South Wales government of the problems with stigma, the problems that stigma produces in producing vulnerability, but it seemingly an inability to deal with that politically in a major way. And what worries me and what concerns me, what I perhaps wanted to open up here as a question, is the ongoing implications of this dynamic. So the dynamics that produce vaccine hesitancy, produce things like the freedom protests, whatever they were, I think still have profound impacts in our social and cultural life that I think we'll be attending to for some time. That's probably enough for me at this stage. And I'm not sure who I hand it over to now. Bill, is that back to you?
It is back to me. Thanks, Matt, and well, thanks all four speakers. And keeping to script and keeping to time as well. Those of you who are also listening in, can you make sure you turn your microphones off, because we can hear conversations going on in the background. There they are, but they're not entirely relevant, I think. Okay, well, look, just a very, very quick summary from that. I mean, Susan has highlighted the issues around green space and livability. Matt C, if I can call you that, has basically said remote working is here to stay. So there's a real impact there on the economic and the property markets, I guess. Bingqin has highlighted the issues around differential state control and the impacts that they have on coordinating responses to these sorts of mass panics, I suppose. And then Matt K has looked at the issues around social inequality, the impacts and differential social control, which clearly were exposed in Western Sydney during the height of the pandemic. So 4 different nuanced perspectives. Now I'm going to throw a few questions at the 4 panelists, and then we'll open up maybe 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes max, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor. Usual way, if you ask questions from the floor, put your little hand up, our little orange hand, and we'll try and Liz will try and make sure she gets you all in the right order, I hope. Okay, so on that basis, let's get going. So first question from me to the panel, and really looking at the health, well-being, and broader social impacts, really. How did the public health orders and their impacts on social and working lives reflect social disadvantage and privilege? Did we learn anything new? What did we learn about what's needed to improve social equity from the experience? And were there any positives from that experience, particularly in terms of differences in terms of class, gender, and age impacts? So who'd like to take that one on first? Matt K, I guess, it kind of lands in your bag, but all of you are fully qualified to respond.
Thanks, Bill. I'm not sure I have much to say other than just to raise some additional questions. It feels to me, and as someone that knows only a little bit about public health, that there is a fairly well documented learning from prior epidemic experiences, and particularly HIV, around notions of stigmatization and kind of centering individual subjects as the center of government kind of public health interventions, as compared to a more community-led and distributed response. And that seemed to be very present in the articulation of responses around the lockdown. And what struck me as particularly compelling and interesting was that the political space that was open to take lessons from previous experiences into the COVID pandemic was shut down quite quickly by virtue of the already divided nature of Sydney's politics and I guess the tone of the political discourse. So the particular moment that struck me as emblematic of that experience was the suggestion that troops should go door to door, which was on anyone's measure a ridiculous suggestion, but that shut down immediately what I think people in public health know works, which is creating approachable avenues for people to engage with public health. So it strikes me that what we're seeing is a lesson that's partially learned from previous experiences, and I guess the question we might want to ask going forward is how do we document, if that is kind of what's one version of what's going on, how might we take some of those lessons and make sure that we are in a position to build on those learnings going forward.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty shocking at the time, the troops going out into Western Sydney. It sends a very clear message. They didn't do that in Bondi, I noticed. Susan, what do you think about the well-being aspect? I mean, open space, really important for mental health. We found through the pandemic.
Well, as Matt was speaking just then, I was just thinking about the issue of the unevenness across Sydney, and certainly we saw, people being locked down, living in Watson's Bay, probably having a very nice experience compared to perhaps somebody out in Punchbowl or in wherever, Western Sydney suburbs. But one thing I did do, and I want to share this as a positive note, I gave my students an assignment. We were in the heart of the lockdowns where they were able to go out within, I think it was so many kilometres of their home. And this was part of a course I run called Healthy Planning, which is all about trying to examine the relationship between place and its health supportive nature. And I got them to do an audit of the health supportive nature of their local environment. And these were students from right across Sydney, and indeed students from overseas as well. And overwhelmingly, they came back with such positive responses in terms of, I'd never known that there was a community garden down the street and around the corner, or I hadn't realised that some nice old people lived a few streets away, or I didn't know there was whatever it was. So that was very heartening to me. It was also nice that I was able to provide them with an exercise, an assignment that was able to be undertaken by them going outside, and they weren't doing anything illegal. So it was that sense of an appreciation of the local. And yes, a lot of it is about green space, and I certainly focused on that. And I think whilst, we might sort of be looking at these differentials, green space comes in all shapes and sizes. There's networks of green space, there's large spaces, there's small spaces. The proximity, we know, to people's homes is incredibly important. And I think as we emerge, hopefully soon, from the pandemic and the learnings from that, we've got to look at the provision of green space as a particularly important aspect of place that is really important right across the life course and for everyone. And we've got some good open space in Sydney, right across the metropolitan area, and some good work happening. But that's probably enough from me.
Actually, I mean, space is really important. We'll get onto that maybe a later question about the issues, the value of space in increasingly dense cities. But Bingqin, what was the picture from Wuhan and the Chinese cities where the lockdown was absolute, and you really couldn't get out? And we all know the built environment in many of those cities.
Yeah, I think that actually raised a particularly interesting question, because especially when we look at the six cities, we sort of see that we see a whole spectrum of a restriction of human mobility or human movement capacity during the pandemic. And then Wuhan is at the extreme, and the other cities are kind of more or less along this. And Stockholm actually didn't even do any lockdown. So within this whole different range of kind of the responses, I was thinking, of course, it is what you can see, particularly during the extreme version. And basically, in terms of that means everybody is locked indoors, and then there needs to be solution to deliver food for everybody in-house. And this partly happened in Australia in some of these high-rise communities. And we interviewed some of these NGOs and food bank, and they face a lot of new challenges in terms of delivery food, different from the usual charity they have to do. And the key issue is actually between the shop or even though people think that you can just use online shopping and get the food delivered to your door. No, because you have a gated community, and the food can only be delivered outside your gated community, and you cannot get out of your door to get the food. So that's kind of difficulty. So that make me think that the logistics system needs to become more flexible, particularly at the end of the last mile. And in the past, there's not much talking about this. Even in the social policy, our teacher always, when we studied social policies, they ask us why we do not need to deal with food in social policy. Partly because you can buy food, and then if you give people a voucher and they can buy food. But with this kind of restriction, people cannot buy food. So how are you going to address this kind of situation? And of course, maybe, who knows, next time, if there's another pandemic, there's no such lockdown. But I do observe some type of disaster, natural disaster, can have similar situation. For example, flood. And when you have flood, a lot of households were becoming isolated. And they have no mobile connection, no food delivery. And of course, when I come to Bingqin, I noticed last year they had this kind of almost a kind of a serious flood. But then a lot of these kind of issues also emerged, become a disaster-made isolation. So the society need to learn how to become more resilient to this.
Yeah, it really does. It really does make that point that it's not just pandemics, but there's all sorts of other things, or challenges to the way we live, and they can be so easily disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. Matt Costa, just as an economist, do you have any view on this issue around social equality? I mean, one of the things that Bingqin alluded to, of course, there were those of us who were able to hole up in our rooms or our flats or our houses, but many other people had to be of different sorts of jobs, of course, out there, had to be out there and were at risk. Is that how do you see that from an economist's point of view?
Unmuting. I think this gets to, I mean, speaking to the research we did on remote working, and that figure of 800,000 odd workers who were able to, so they were non-essential workers, effectively, you know, like myself as an economist, who could then work from home. But then you also have all of the essential workers who are carrying on with their work and obviously being exposed to increased risk of transmission of COVID, but then also non-essential workers who can't work remotely and can't carry on and therefore furloughed or unable to work. So there's this technological innovation benefits some of us more than others. We also found a correlation between higher income and the ability to work remotely, but there are swings and roundabouts with it. So for example, you know, dentists, high income earners, but can't perform remote dentistry as yet. And, you know, for example, call center workers may not be particularly high earning, but can benefit from this innovation. We also found gender impacts. So, for example, it seems like from what we found in our research that more flexible and remote working advantages women who report higher productivity gains, possibly because of the kinds of work that women on average do, and potentially because they shoulder more care work, and therefore the flexibility is more advantageous to the kinds of interests that they have to balance in doing that. We also heard concerns that this shift to remote working would potentially render women invisible at work. I think this was something a comment made by Julia Gillard at one stage. Interestingly, though, men want to work remotely as much as women, and I think that more than the fact that women want to work remotely will help to normalise the practice and mitigate against that potential bias of treatment. And we're seeing leading employers deliberately restructuring their workplaces to try and make them equitable in that way for people who are working remotely. And of course, then there's the access to work that this shift potentially provides to people who couldn't otherwise work. So without that flexibility, there are groups who can't participate in work at all. And obviously participating is better than not participating or having the option to. We also found that young people and single people were more affected by the social isolation aspect of remote working, which was a really interesting finding. I guess you would think that younger people being more, and again, these are sort of stereotypes, but preconceptions would be that older people would be less interested in remote working and younger people would be more interested in it because of attraction to using technology and that sort of thing. But it's actually the opposite, because work and is an important place of social interaction and meeting people, and particularly important for young people and single people. It turns out that they report to us. So really interesting differential impacts there.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, you really highlight the differential impact across a whole range of difference, really. Gender, age, ethnicity, locality, whatever. These things don't hit people all in the same way. And I think that's one of the difficulties of understanding what the implications of it are. Moving on a bit about to the issues around, what features of city life did we look at differently as a result of the pandemic? For example, fear of the crowd, the commute, everybody backed off that, and are we ever going to get public transport back to the same level? The role of the home office, in a sense, the work-life balance, has that changed? Are we different there? And just the kind of maybe the perception of density, which of course has been all the rage amongst planners for the last 30 years, suddenly becomes more of a threat than an attraction. Do we want that? Bingqin, of course, is living proof that some people don't. So there's some really interesting issues around new meanings of the city that come out of the pandemic. Anybody would like to pitch into that question or make a response?
I've got lots to say if I can.
Margaret, you got a moment you come in a moment, okay? This is the panel so far.
Oh,
so,
sorry, sorry. I thought you said the panel. I thought you said anyone.
You've booked your place as the first in the queue, so well done there. Okay, Susan. Sorry, are you going to say something, Susan?
Yeah. Well, look, there's a lot to be said, but can I just add a couple of comments about health and well-being benefits of perhaps the new work-life balance, the work from home. And this is not from research that I've done, but colleagues have, and I've been privy to some of the discussions. But on the positive side of work from home, people have reported having more time for leisure activities involving physical activity, and physical activity is one of the most important things that we can do for our health. Interestingly, people talked a lot about more time to make meals, to cook food from natural ingredients, provided they could get them to the door. And I acknowledge what you've been saying, Bingqin, about the that last mile. But we also know from the health area that I work in that cooking your food yourself is a much healthier way to eat. And then there was also the involvement of other members of the family in that process. So some positives. On the negative side, and it was really interesting what you were just saying, Matt, commuting, going into the office, coming home, that has a lot of physical activity just built into it. It's kind of more like incidental physical activity that people do without even sort of realising. So we've even heard of people who actually, from the work from home, they actually went on a walk around the block every morning as to sort of mimic their daily commute, because they were not getting sufficient physical activity. So that was an interesting, perhaps negative outcome for some. So some interesting issues there, positives and negatives around health and wellbeing.
Anybody else from the panel who wish to comment on the sort of impact on the way we think about the city and move about in the city?
Can I? Yeah, I just add one response to what Susan just mentioned about the commuting. And that is very interesting to me, because before this COVID-19, I always thought that commuting is the single biggest factor that affects people's subjective well-being. But then when people are actually locked down, they gain out of this. So this is a fascinating kind of a phenomenon. And also another issue, I think probably is also about the rural-urban linkage. And particularly, of course, now I'm still in the urban, but in a smaller town area. I sort of realized that when I moved from the Sydney to the smaller town area, and I understand why the Australian government is trying so hard to encourage people to go to smaller towns. And it's not only the lifestyle difference, it's also in terms of service and necessary services, healthcare, these kind of, and everything is become more difficult. But then the important thing is, I hope after the COVID-19, because more people, particularly who have the capacity to move out of the bigger town, let's say doctors, and they don't have to be in big town and come to smaller town. And that can potentially attract people, more people. When the service is improved, and they can attract more people to relocate.
Yeah, decentralization, something which Australia really hasn't embraced. Matt Kearnes.
Yeah, thanks. This might be a bit silly, but the things that COVID made me think about the city were places that I'd forgotten about, right? Like windswept car parks where we probably all had countless COVID tests. And in fact, I took my kids to have a PCR test just the other week at our local car park, and realized it had been packed up and it is no longer there. So we had to find another car park to sit and have a COVID test in. RSL clubs, and sporting clubs, places where there were these pop-up clinics that were generated through community effort. And there's a slightly fashionable bit of social science that suggests that we don't gather together as communities in the same way that we used to. And there's a long-running bit of social theory around that, and the COVID, I think, suggests that needs to be rethought, right? And it makes me think about like urban spaces that are reusable and can be repurposed. And I was really intrigued, for example, around the max vaccination centre in Homebush, a place that otherwise you might go to if you wanted to watch rugby league, for example. Then we're going to as this collective effort for the first round of the vaccines. And so it made me think about places that were being actively repurposed in somewhat ad hoc ways and somewhat more planned ways. And it made me really think about those spaces that we perhaps don't often think of as really key bits of urban fabric and structure.
Yes, we've all been in those sort of weird places in the last couple of years. Now, look, I think it's time to move on, actually. So I've, in the next 10, 15 minutes max, we've got questions from the floor, and we've already got one booked in from Margaret Tipper from West Ear. So, Margaret, what do you want to say? Pitch your question to the panel, please.
I don't sort of pitching and sort of a comment. I also represent the chair of the local community services association with neighbourhood centres. So one of the things I'd say that place-based was really something important that came out, not just of COVID-backed disasters and having local knowledge. But some of the issues I think, and I don't know whether the panel can address this, is some of the issues that we found, the whole issue of connectivity. There was an expectation that everyone had digital connectivity, even in the city, but depend on what service provider you had. But we also had families that maybe there was one mobile phone to do all the schoolwork for, say, a family of 3 and things. They're the long-term issues I think perhaps as planners and things need to be addressed. Regardless of whether they're a COVID or a disaster response, but just a daily living thing. The other thing, Susan, I'm really interested in the issue of design, that once we go over so many floors, we should be having nice little green spaces on buildings. And I feel very sorry for people that had to be locked in. And I was in a lock-in suburb. It was mentally very, very draining. So I don't think that we're going to see some of the long-term physical health and mental outcomes for quite a long period of time. So perhaps commentary there, perhaps some thoughts from the panel. And one thing on the Defence Forces going in to areas around Fairfield and things, the service providers I know prepared their client bases really well. And so there were some really funny incidents where the police or the Defence Forces were delivering and they're going, oh, don't take me away, don't take me away. Like there was actually some really great integration and some real healing done around that sort of thing as well.
Thanks, Margaret. Comments back from the panel?
I might speak a bit to the issue of density. So I'd say there's a difference between high density living and crowding, and I think they're two separate issues. So I mean, it is possible to do high density in a way that incorporates green space, and of course, green space is accessible in different ways depending on whether you have low density or high density housing, in the sense that you can have low density housing with privatized green space, or high density living with communal green space, or with no green space, depending on how it's done. So it's important to think through those issues. Some of the health issues can relate to building standards rather than density. So for example, cross ventilation is not an issue of density. And obviously it has health impacts, and we saw that in buildings where there wasn't adequate ventilation, there could be COVID transmission in those buildings. So that has more to do with building standards. So again, distinguishing that from the issue of density, and also the way that low density can actually be related to issues of crowding. So if you have a planning system that facilitates low density for some, that corresponds to crowding for those who aren't able to access it. So just raising a few of those issues. I think I'll just leave it there. And others may want to chime in.
Thanks, Pat. Anyone want to input at this point? Yep. Bingqin?
I would be happy to discuss about the role of community and also the decision making, particularly probably also related to urban planning field. And before COVID-19, there had already been a lot of this kind of experiment on participatory decision on, let's say, the usage of green space and this, and also I think probably after the COVID-19. And because what I sort of noticed that quite often the local authorities in our sort of a case study, the government actually is better at doing coordinated role rather than just making the decision directly. And then but the communities have so much creative energy. And that also, when you use the green space and also planners as well need to be more open to the communities and to the suggestions, and working together. Hopefully that can address a lot of immediate on-the-ground issues more effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the pandemic really brought to the fore the role of public sector and also community responses, as do all the flooding and so on. It's an interesting contrast to the idea that the market can solve everything. I would hate to think if we was just over to the free market to solve, but I may be biased. Matt Kearnes, you got a comment here?
Yeah, just a quick couple of comments, I guess. Prior to COVID, one of the projects I had the pleasure of being involved doing a range of focus groups around different parts of Sydney. And one of the things that really stood out in that research is people would say things like this: "This is the best part of Sydney to live in, best part of Sydney to grow families up in. The problem here is other people." And other people is figured through the language of traffic or congestion or whatever it might be. So wherever you are in Sydney, people wanted to tell us that this is a great part of Sydney as compared to other parts of the city, right? And what was really interesting in that research is what was kind of not present in people's commentary was what I might call a metropolitan articulation. So people's sense of community was very much a local framing, or friends and family, or sporting clubs, neighbours, etc. And when we talk about public participation, we often think about that at a scale of the local. And COVID, I think, exacerbated, quite profound divisions in our city and quite profound anxieties and corrosive, I think, politics of Sydney. I think there's an opportunity to build participation at a metropolitan scale, where we are actually working towards a sense that we actually have something in common and we have bonds with different parts of the city. So, like the history of planning in Sydney is a history of hitting one part of Sydney against the other, right? So overdevelopment along the Sydenham to Bankstown corridor, for example, is a case in point, or West Connects, pitting, there's transport justice needs of the western suburbs against the leafy suburbs of the inner city. These are just two examples of like long history of pitting one part of the city against the other. So I think there's a key role for planners to address questions of participation at that metropolitan scale, to actually think of our city as a city, rather than as a broad geographical area of quite distinct kind of sub-communities or suburbs or what have you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I remember doing a survey on Western Sydney about 20 years ago. Who cares about Western Sydney, it was called. We interviewed, market research, Western Sydney. Like 75%, 80% of the people we talked to in the survey said they thought Western Sydney was a brilliant place, was a great place. And and it was all about their locality and their neighbourhood. That was what the focus was. And you're quite right. And I think the pandemic may well have helped accentuate that focus on the local as well. With the local areas are going to become more, sort of activated now. That 30% of us, I think it's 30% of office workers will work at home for some of the time, or 30% of the time they'll work at home, could well have an impact at the local level. Okay, well, we've got literally 5 minutes left. Oh, Susan, do you want to?
I just wanted to just pick up that point, Bingqin, your point about the community innovation and creative energy. I mean, there are lots of examples of that, and I think that's something that we might well document and be, it's good to have some really positive community stories. And I saw, many of those things in my neighbourhood, and I'm sure other people did, but just, teddy bears in windows for children to say hi to and count, and some beautiful examples of the way people use the local parks. I saw a family with their pet rabbits one day setting up a little sort of fenced area. The rabbits were having nice meal of the lovely green grass in the park, and everyone was just delighted, and it was just an afternoon after work one day. So yeah, and lots more.
Steady on, you make it sound as if it was a wonderful experience for all concerned. So I don't think it was.
No, I'm not, but I'm just saying it's really important that we do bring to the fore these positives as well as critique the negatives. So
okay.
Yeah.
Look, we've got almost on time, but is there one quick question that anybody wants to pitch to the panel at this late stage? Speak now or for forever? Don't speak. I can't see any hands going up. Okay. Well, I think that's a good time to stop. We haven't overstayed our welcome. Look, I'd like to thank the panelists very much for what was a very interesting set of provocations. I think Kylie in the chat suggested early on covered a range of really interesting areas. Just showed how diverse the impact of the pandemic has been on the way we think about things and how it's descented a lot of our thinking on things. So I'd like to thank you, all four of you, for that, and also for your responses to the rather staged questions that came out of me. Kylie, you've come in. Do you want to say something to wrap it up?
Just to thank you as well, Bill.
Okay. Oh, well, I did nothing. I sat here and just waffled on for a bit. Anyway, I'd like also to thank Liz out there, who's kind of managed the whole thing very much so, and thanks for your input and making sure this has been recorded, I think, so it will be available somewhere. Liz.
Yes, I won't. Just more thank yous from me to Carly for initiating it, and to all the panelists today for a very engaging and thoughtful discussion. And if you're here, it means you registered, so you will get the link to the video recording, it usually within a week or so. So thank you very much, and please feel free to join us for our final SPR seminar of the year on the 30th of November on non-traditional research outputs. So hopefully you have all received an invitation to that if you're on our mailing lists.
Okay, so thanks once again to Mats, Bingqin, and Susan, and I'm sure this issue won't go away. It's thing is going to fascinate academics for a long time to come.
And thank you, Bill, for
and policy people
facilitating and sharing.
Okay, well, goodbye everybody, and have a safe safe trip back down to your kitchen, presumably.